Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Black Book Podcast. Today we have another segment called Because of Slavery, and we have Dr. John Aden today who's going to talk about his ideas of what is because of slavery.
The transatlantic slave trade, I'll kind of start there.
Sure, yeah.
Obviously, as people were injected into the Atlantic world and the Atlantic system, right? Like as historians, as social historians, we talk about the Atlantic as a system because it's different than any other part of the world in that era. Europeans are coming to the African continent, mostly in West and Central Africa, and they start, making deals with African coastal elites, and they ship Africans into the Atlantic world. And, once our ancestors move into the Atlantic world, like their lives were transformed, pretty dramatically. But the one good thing, so I read this really deep book in grad school. It's called Flash of the Spirit by Robert Thompson. He was a Yale art history professor. And what he argues in the book is that even though Europeans try to obliterate African cultures, plural, they basically, with slavery, all the violence, the terrorism, that our ancestors and elders experienced, like they basically failed. I mean, they succeeded in some ways in terms of like damaging our collective psyche, making us doubt ourselves, not giving us access to resources. But even in the face of all of that, there's like certain stuff that we do that Africans do and have always done. I'll never forget. So I was in Mali. I was doing my field work there, and I mentioned last time in the first installment, the chair of the linguistics department put me in his compound and wouldn't let me leave, and he gave me these two 5-year-old kids that dragged me all over the neighborhood and introduced me to new vocabulary, new ways to speak, all that. And one day I'm in the compound and all these women are preparing food because, like, and even in the African cultures today, although it's modernizing like really rapidly, but women spend a lot of their day preparing food. They get up really early, they go to the market, 5, 6 a.m., they buy all their, fruits, vegetables, and then, they bring it back, they prepare food, or, egg sandwiches. And Mali's a French colonized country, so people have, French bread, egg sandwiches. That's a big deal for breakfast. And while they were preparing this food, there was a little boy in the compound, and he was, he was whining. He was acting like he was crying, but he was faking. And I turned to him. This was after I'd been in Mali, I don't know, probably 3 months. But I'd been there before, so my vomina started to get really good. And I could basically speak for an hour and 45 minutes without people realizing I'm not a native speaker. Like, they look at me and tell I'm not a native speaker, but to listen to what's coming out of my mouth, that's something different,
Right.
So I turned to this little boy and I said, do you want me to give you something to cry about? And the women in the compound fell out. I'll never forget, they were pounding grain in their mortars and pestles, and I heard these mortars and pestles hit the ground. And I turn around and they are roaring laughing. And they're like, hey, Issa. My Bamana name was Issa, which is, short for Idris, which is also short abbreviation for like Jesus, right? So it's ironic they kind of gave me, as a Westerner, a Christian name in Islam, right? So the layers are like deep. So they're like, hey, Issa, Ekeda Bamana, yada, yada, yada. You become a real, true Bamana person right now. And that's like the highest compliment anyone could pay you in this culture. And I mean, they meant it. And I was like, what? So I said, why are you saying that? And they said, where did you learn to say that expression? And I was like, this is what my parents told me when I was fake crying. This is what I heard Black women and black men say to their children in their
Right.
households when a young child was cutting up, probably just because I was a guest visiting, right? So you know how it is. You know, the real shorties, they get to acting out when somebody new show up at the crib. And
Mm.
so, I just translated out of my experience to him, and I didn't know if it was going to work. It worked flawlessly. They were like, we say that to our children. And I was like, wow. And then in that moment, I started looking at what are all the other ways that African American culture and African culture are similar, or I'll even
Mm.
go farther, they're the same, right? And so then I saw it's not just the way we discipline our kids, it's the way we talk to our children, it's the way we celebrate around food, it's the way we mourn losses,
Mm.
grieving, funerals. I mean, obviously, Mali's a Muslim country, so there's rules like the body has to be washed by the family and buried within 3 days. The body's
Mm.
washed, wrapped in white linen, and then buried. And that obviously we don't have burials that quickly. That's a requirement in Islam. But the way, the funeral, the repast, like all of that, and it just, I feel like I was in a time machine. And so, when you talk about like what are some positive things, for me, the positive thing is, I mean, even like looking at this election, the people are worried, like, will there be violence? Like, that's a real concern.
Mm.
But I'm like, they tried to exterminate us already.
Right.
Like, I mean, really tried. Really tried. Like, the Belgian Congo, great example, between 18, what is it, 1898 and 1909, the Belgians in the Belgian Congo exterminate 15 million African people. Like, during the colonial period. And that's the thing, like, people, and I try not to compare atrocities or anything like that. But when people say, oh, the Holocaust, 12 million people died, and usually people only say 6 million people because they're focused only on the people of Jewish ancestry. But there were 6 million other people that the Nazis tried to exterminate in World War II. The Roma, who are pejoratively called gypsies,
Mm.
who, moved it, and they were kind of what we call a transhuman community. Not nomadic, they kind of wandered on regularized patterns all across Europe
Right.
at certain intervals, right? And then anyone who was born, any child born with a cleft palate, any child born with one leg longer than the other, any child born with a club foot, the Nazis tried to kill all those people. Plus anybody who was gay, lesbian, bisexual, they sent all those people to the gas chambers, and I'm like, so when people talk about, Holocaust, I'm like, yeah, that's real. Like, I'm not like diminishing that at all. And we want to talk about Holocaust, 15 million Africans were exterminated in Central Africa. And unlike the Holocaust in Europe, there's no names for these people. They had names, but nobody wrote them down, right? And the
Mm.
Belgians were just there to extract rubber and other commodities, from African societies in Central Africa, and like they exterminated 15 million people.
Mm.
It was only until the rest of the European international order, decried very loudly that the Belgians were doing this that they stopped. It had to go to, it ended up in the League of Nations before, the precursor to the UN.
Right.
So when I say like they tried to exterminate us, they tried. They tried. And we're still here, right? And so in this book, Flash of the Spirit, that I read in grad school, it's an art history text, this guy, white professor, is like, and when he wrote it, it was really controversial, but he just cataloged all of the things he called survivals. He said, these are the survivals from African cultures that have made it to the New World. And the list is long as hell. And so when I had this experience in Mali, I was like, it just kind of hit me. Like, I knew I'm Afrocentric. I'm not wild with Afrocentrism. I'm not into Hotepism, Like I'm into a kind of rational, we should center our experience around African history, African culture,
Right.
right? And because we're descendants of African people. But we're other things too. We have Native American in our ancestry. We have European in our ancestry. Like and the struggle for African Americans is to figure out how to celebrate some of that, some of the European side too, because we've not been treated as co-equals in this society
Right.
since forever, right? So we're kind of predisposed to not want to celebrate that. But once I realized how many survivals there were, like my jaw just kept dropping open. And then the more time I spent in the African continent, the more I saw it. I just saw survivals everywhere.
Mm.
And so, for me, if there's something that's positive, it's that cultural values can survive the worst circumstances other human beings can throw at human beings. Um, for me, that's hopeful. You
Let me
know,
let me ask you about like Juneteenth and like
yeah,
so in the middle of the pandemic we all decide to now is the time to widely celebrate Juneteenth because I'll be honest um I wasn't hip to Juneteenth for a really long time. Like I knew what it was.
right,
Coming out of university, coming out of college, I knew what it was.
right,
Because I just took African American history classes and things like that. Like before I went to Wabash, I had no idea what Juneteenth was. Even afterwards, like looking at my my family structure, none of us ever celebrated Juneteenth, right?
mm, mm,
Until we went to the South one time because
right,
I got family all over. You know what I'm saying? I got
yeah,
family in California, New York, Mississippi, Detroit, things like that. We went back to Mississippi because that's like the origination of our family.
right.
And
Mine too.
one of them were like, well, we doing this for Juneteenth, and everybody looked at them, and like all the people from the North were like, oh, okay, and then people from the South were like, y'all don't celebrate Juneteenth, and we were like, no, not really. And I'm saying we got this little history lesson, but you know,
Right.
so this year we started celebrating as a, I guess, widely as a cultural, as a
Yeah.
people culture of people.
Yeah.
We started celebrating Juneteenth. Like, is that a like? I guess I want to ask, like, as you know, maybe it's late, maybe it's not late, but because obviously we know the history of Juneteenth, which is this
Mm,
is actually when is when the last of the slaves were free back in in Texas, basically. You know what I'm
right.
saying?
Right. Right.
Um, um, but I like to think of it as that, like, because some people like to say that it's not, it doesn't actually, it's not a representation of when all of the slaves were freed. But I like to think that maybe it is because like we can't actually recognize freedom if everyone's not free. Um,
Right.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that's what Juneteenth kind of represents. That yeah, those people it sucked that they that they had to they were still enslaved or thought they were slaves for a couple extra years, but this
Mm,
day represents the day that they actually knew and they could walk off the fucking off the plantation and things like that. So asking you, like, how should we be celebrating um Juneteenth? Is it just like how we have always celebrated other holidays, like you know chill with the family, barbecue, what I'm saying, music it out, things like
right.
that.
Yeah. I mean, you made me think a little bit about Kwanzaa, which maybe we can touch on in a second. But
Yeah,
I mean, yeah. So the irony of Juneteenth is that it's always been celebrated, like, and
right,
not just in the South, but it started in Texas, of course. Um, and but it's been mostly underground. Like there are a lot of African cultural festivals that happen in parks all over the country every summer,
right,
and they're the people who are the diehards, like elders. And I've been to Juneteenth celebrations in Milwaukee. They got a huge black community there. I've been to them all over the country, really, but maybe mostly the Upper Midwest and in some of the Eastern Seaboard places. Just if I happened to be there when it was being celebrated. But should we celebrate it? I mean, you raise a good point. Like, can we really celebrate liberation if everybody's not free? I mean, that's just me kind of rephrasing what you were, you
Mm-hmm.
know, noting. And I think you raise a really good point, but I think in given the Holocaust that we've endured as a people, yeah, we need celebration points. Like we need to kind of lift those up. And in many ways, Juneteenth is kind of like a harvest celebration,
Mm.
just like Kwanzaa is a harvest celebration. I mean, I have more issues with Kwanzaa than I do with Juneteenth, which maybe we can get to in a sec. But
Okay.
I think it's powerful. I mean, I know it's powerful. I know that part of what's troubling about celebrating it is the people who enslaved you are now setting you free and you're celebrating that. There's something off about that.
Right.
Like, are they giving you permission to celebrate your independence? If it was Frederick Douglass who said, I'm just paraphrasing that, power concedes nothing without a demand. Well, that's his popular quote. But another quote he had was, they give you your freedom, they can take it back. And this was
Mm.
a statement he made repeatedly when he was recruiting African Americans to join the Civil War effort. Because, on the eve of the Civil War, when the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter in, South Carolina, you know, Frederick Douglass is boarding a ship to go to Liberia. He's leaving America. And he
Mm.
comes back and becomes this, he's already this amazing statesman, but he leaves this other legacy. And he convinces African Americans in the North to like join the Union Army and to fight for freedom. And the great irony is like Northerners didn't want black people necessarily, they wanted them freed, but they didn't want to live with them. They didn't want integration. That was never
Yeah.
any of their goal. They just wanted to eliminate slavery, and then they could. But they hadn't thought very far beyond. Well, what happens to these people after we set them free? Where do they go? What resources do they have? Initially, the North intended to like put those resources, behind black people, 40 acre and a mule, and even more in other places. And then it just never happened because Lincoln was assassinated and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was an ardent Southerner who really romanticized the Southern Confederacy. So instead, Lincoln wanted to drop hardcore penalties on everyone in the South for trying to secede from the Union. I mean, economic penalties, plus they had to sign a loyalty oath, and he had like a 9-point plan. Well, he didn't get to implement any of it, and Johnson comes into power as the president, new president, after Lincoln's assassination, and he's like, I don't want to do any of that. I'll just let white Southerners say, yeah, we wish we hadn't have done that. And then, look, literally within a year of the Civil War ending, there are Southern members of the Confederacy who are back in Congress,
Mm.
right? So, like, yeah, I mean, I totally get what you're saying, but I do think it's important to celebrate. Anytime enslaved people are liberated, like, hey, celebrate that, because it's just one step in a really long journey. Um, Now, Kwanzaa, I mentioned Kwanzaa, so like obviously this is a celebration, and unlike Juneteenth, like Kwanzaa is a totally manufactured holiday,
Right.
right? Like it's something that Black people in the '60s created. Dr. Malana Karenga, who was a member of US, which was a group that fought against the Black Panthers in the streets. They had running, literal battles in the streets of
Mm.
Oakland. He created this holiday. The problem with Kwanzaa is that it doesn't correspond. I mean, they took words out of like the Swahili tradition, from the Swahili coast. But those societies were urban. They weren't rural. I mean, they
Mm.
were urban. These were urban societies. This civilization of the Swahili is urban. It's not just urban, but they had huge cities on the East African coast. They were cosmopolitan. People from the Swahili coast were traveling to Zanzibar and the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf and as far away as China and trading with people. They were cosmopolitan people. And
Mm.
so, this idea of cooperative economics, that didn't exist on the East African coast. People was trying to get theirs in, right? So the thing about it is like when you create a holiday like this for nationalist empowerment, and like Black people have jumped all over it. Like we celebrate Kwanzaa. You know, people ask me as a director of the African American History Museum in Fort Wayne, it's something I do on a volunteer basis. They're like, you know, we want you to show up at our Kwanzaa celebration. And I'm like, okay. I'm always in a weird spot because the Africanist scholar in me knows like the values that are being promoted in Kwanzaa were not the values running on the East African coast. The East African coast had a massive slave trade. It was Africans enslaving other Africans.
Right.
Now, the slave trade, I mean, we got to talk about it. It's not the same as the European slave trade. There's lots of assumptions that are different in African labor systems than in what would become the transatlantic system that our ancestors experienced, right? And some of the differences are profound. Like in West Africa, if you were enslaved, you were a member of a union. If your master abused you verbally or physically, you filed a grievance with the Council of Elders and they'll set you free. Like the other major difference was you could marry whomever you chose, your children inherited all the inheritance rights from both parents. Like the shit's totally different. And, you know, when I do tours, well, we're closed now because of the virus, but when I do tours, you know, at the museum, I have an entire, like, presentation that I do just about the transatlantic slave trade and about how African labor systems looked before Europeans arrived. And it's profound. So when I look at the values promoted in Kwanzaa, like, they just don't match what East Africans were doing in the pre-colonial period or the colonial period. You know, there were really long, one of the most brutal and kind of celebrated African leaders in East Africa was this dude named Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip controlled a vast swath of territory from the area, the hinterland behind the Swahili coast, all the way to the Great Lakes region, thousands of miles. And caravan traders would come into his territory, and he had armed young men, and they served as his, you know, his army, his militia. And so in order to enter his trading territory, you had to kick him down money. And then in order to exit, you had to kick him down money. And people would go, these massive caravans, Eric, man, they would walk from horizon line to horizon line to horizon line, just people carrying ivory, carrying enslaved people or transporting them. And then all the other commodities you could get from the interior would be transported down to the coast, and then they would flow into the Indian Ocean, right? They would go to they would be shipped to Zanzibar, some of the other islands, you know, off the coast of present-day Kenya, Tanzania. Like, and this dude was a brutal slave owner, like, seriously, straight up African, you know, wealthy as all get out, you know? So for me, like, when I hear like Kuji Chagalia or, you know, any of the other terms that are associated with Kwanzaa, I'm like, okay, this is manufactured to give Black people a sense of national heritage and identity. But this isn't an African celebration, right? And
so it doesn't match. It doesn't necessarily match what we think. What we think it's matching.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Like, you know, it's called a first fruits or, you know, celebrate harvest festival, you know, and it celebrates like the cornucopia, the symbols that they chose are all rural symbols from farming. And sure, there's farming communities on the East African coast, not denying that. It's been maybe behind the coast more so. But the thing is, like, this was an urban culture. And the Swahili civilization is off the freaking chain. There were poets who were writing at the 1000 of the Common Era, you know, and they wrote poetry for 300 years straight. You know, like when we talk about, yeah, there's Shakespeare, and I'm not dissing Shakespeare. I think he's amazing, you know, because I just appreciate high art, period. You know, so I think Shakespeare's dope. But so are some of the, you know, poets that, and many of them are nameless, that wrote on the Swahili coast. And they wrote for 500 years. You know, so it's like, to me, it all becomes relative at a point where it starts to become meaningless. You know, But when they talk about cooperative economics, like, nah, there wasn't cooperative economics. But there was a book I read in grad school, man, it's a really dope book by this Africanist historian named Jonathan Glassman. It's called Feast and Riot. And it's about the emerging like worker consciousness on the Swahili coast. And he describes this really rich world where like there's Indian financiers, who are bringing, like they create credit markets in East Africa. So if people wanted to go on these caravan routes, they would basically like, they would have an apartment in the city, they would sign on for one of these caravans, go into the interior for 2 months, come back. If they had a tusk of ivory they were carrying, they would drop it off at a customs house, and the customs house would evaluate the quality of the ivory. Because the brides in India wanted ivory bangles to go on their ankles for their wedding trousseaux. Like this is what their husbands, the grooms, were supposed to gift them when they got married. They didn't gift them a ring, they gifted them, and we talking about bangles that are thick, dude, like this, ornately carved, that would slip over the bride's ankle and she would wear it, and everybody would be like, oh, she flossing. Because her man kicked her down a fat anklet, right? And so, like, this is the history of the East African coast, and it's amazing. And so to see that, to see how urban this space is, and how Indians and even people from Zanzibar who are African and Arab and Indian, all three ethnic groups or racial groups, kind of, well, ethnic groups combined, you know, they're loaning money to people. Like they got their own banks. You know, so when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, this is not cooperative economics. Everybody's preying on everybody else. But Kwanzaa is telling us this other story. So I'm always in this awkward position as an Africanist. So I know more than most people will ever know about this region. And, you know, if they didn't live there, you know, before, and I haven't lived there, or they didn't study it. So for me, I'm always like, now you compare and contrast, you know, Juneteenth, yeah, that's a real holiday. I'm just saying that. Maybe some people will give me some flack. I'll get dragged for saying that. But it's a real historical holiday. Kwanzaa is a manufactured, you know, holiday.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So.
Okay, so what I'm getting is that, you know, basically we have, for us African Americans, Africans born in America, however people want to label us, we have some of our behaviors and things that we do still sort of match what we would have been like if we had stayed in Africa, and current Africans living in from the continent. But there are some things that don't match. And maybe that is because of slavery, or maybe that is just because we don't know. That is because, you know, whatever.
Combination of it all. I mean, Karenga, you know, well, in the 60s, well, at the end of the 60s, when, you know, King is assassinated, the Black Power movement is already unfolding, and many African Americans have started traveling to Africa on cultural exchanges, either through the U.S. government, like there were some, you know, U.S. government agencies that supported artists traveling abroad. But African Americans have always traveled to Africa. I mean, that's just a part of the history. So even during the slave trade period, there were freeborn people traveling back and forth to Africa. So it's just what we take away from it.
Well, man, I thank you for the conversation, dude. I want to leave it here because I don't want to take too much of your time, and I want to go eat dinner.
Just let me put a plug in really super quickly. So
absolutely, dude, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So if anybody wants to learn more about African history, I have, you know, my African history course. It's a monthly course. It's a paid course, but it's like right now it's running $47 a month, or you can get the entire year for $397 and save 29%. And it's at AfricanHistoryMonthly.com. And so if you want to check it out, go over there and check it out. And basically every month dropping gems. I teach everything I learned in grad school, plus everything I learned after I started teaching. So it's 25 years worth of my knowledge of African history in that course.
Oh, okay. 25 years. That's a lot. That's a whole lot.
Yeah, dropping gems, man.
Okay. Well, dude, thanks again. I'm definitely check out the class. I know we you and I have been talking about this for a while. I remember the first time we talked, you were telling me how you're, working on this class, and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to looking at it. But thanks again. I'm just on a mission. I'm trying to live my dream.